Good afternoon and welcome to this roundtable in which in the next hour and a half we hope we will give all of you some insights and some inspiration into the journey ahead for shipping. My name's Christopher Rodrigues. I'm definitely the new boy around the table, having taken over as chair of the Maritime and Coastguard Agency in April. I am not a maritime person, I'm a river person, having been involved in the river and being currently the chair of the Port of London Authority. So I have some insight into this, but I'm glad to say that we have around the table a group of people who have tremendous experience and very valuable insight. So we're going to start by my asking them to introduce themselves, and then we'll go to some of the questions. I think at the end of this, one of the questions I want to make sure we've addressed is, what can Britain do to take advantage of this period of change? Because even though I am not a maritime person, from the perspective of a port, you can see that the years ahead are going to be very different from the years we've been living through in the last decade or two. And for all of us, it's a question of, are we ready? And in particular, is there joined up thinking? So I'm sure that's going to come out during the session. So without further ado, David, would you like to start off the introductions?
Thank you very much, Christopher. So I'm David Evans. I'm an associate partner in EY. I've been advising shipping companies for the past 30 years, and that's across the whole range of shipping. So oilfield services, drilling companies, seismic companies, through container lines, bulk carriers, LNG carriers, and cruise ships. So mainly on the tax side, but inevitably, if you're doing tax, you get involved in pretty much everything. So that's what I do.
Good afternoon, I'm Martin CrawfordBrent. I'm CEO of Lookout Maritime. 25 years in the business. I've spent some time in ship classification after a technical qualification. I did mechanical engineering and naval architecture. And my journey has been around safety and sustainability for the last 25 years, through class and then eventually as CEO of RightShip, where I was responsible for vetting and really working with 62 different charterers and a number of ship owners and operators, trying to ensure that the interests of the ship operator, the port and terminal, and the freight interest or the charterer were met in the safety score. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Brian Johnson, Chief Executive of the Maritime and Coastguard Agency, as well as, obviously, from the name, running the Coast Guard in the UK with the Maritime Regulator and run the UK Ship Register. And are getting increasingly involved in thinking about decarbonisation, preparing for the future, and looking at how we can work with our close partners in Department for Transport on creating advantage for the UK through decarbonisation in the future.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jonathan Campbell. I'm the UK Chief Financial Officer of MSC Cruises, the world's largest third largest cruise brand, and also part of the wider MSC Group, which is one of the world's largest container line, terminal investments and ferry groups globally. I've been working in shipping and I'm an accountant by profession, but I've been working in shipping and ship finance for more than 20 years. And I agree with Christopher's comment. It's an unprecedented time in terms of where we are, the experience that we've just been through over the past 18 months, particularly when I have my cruise hat on. It's been difficult, and we're not through the storm yet, but we've also learned a huge amount in that time, and that the lessons from the past 18 months I think can help inform us as we move forward to the strategic challenges ahead that we'll be talking about today.
Yeah, my name's Graham Westgarth, and I'm the chairman of V.Group and also the vice president of the UK Chamber of Shipping. If Christopher is the new boy on the block, I think I'm going to claim the old boy on the block. I've been in this industry for 50 years. I spent 18 years at sea, and then the last 30 plus years in various executive positions with what I believe are quality companies. And when I told my kids that I had passed the 50-year mark, which actually was 9/11 last week, I got a text message from my son back saying, "Oh, do you miss the paddle steamers?" So, the point being is actually we've moved. I've seen massive transition in this industry, and we're going to see even more in the next 10 or 15 years or 20 years. And I think it's just so exciting and such a great opportunity for what I believe is just a great industry.
Hi everyone, I'm Richard Stevens. I'm a tax partner at Watson Farley. So I've just had my 20th anniversary at Watson Farley. So cleverly I started my career just as tonnage tax came in the UK. So I've sort of grown up with tonnage tax, as it were, as a tax lawyer, so that's one of my main focuses. But equally, I do a very similar job to David. So we act on all sorts of shipping matters, so cruise, LNG, whatever else it may be, lots of finance work, and sort of increasingly in recent years, sort of non-tax work around helping particularly cruise companies with issues that they may face operating in the UK.
Brilliant. Well, I think that proves we've got some expertise around the table, which is always useful when you have discussions like this. It's so easy to get people who are free to have a round table, but not necessarily informed enough to participate. So thank you all for being here on behalf of the audience. There are a number of facets to this discussion today. We'll talk about decarbonisation, about the impact of autonomy, about trade and shipping in the future world, about money, which is relevant. And then we talk a little bit, I hope, about the UK, both in terms of its opportunities, if it seizes them, and what it has to do to seize them, and particularly who's got to be in the room together to make sure that these things happen. And then we'll finally talk a little bit about the role of flags and how they might have some impact on pushing people in the right direction. One other thing I'd like to tease out from the experts is the sense of pace. I think listening to you around the table, we're all at one, which is we're living through a period when we're going to have to move quite quickly. But that lesson about the convoy goes as fast as the slowest ship is a real issue. So one of the questions I have for those of us who believe that we should be in the vanguard and part of the solution, not part of the observer corps, is how do we get coalitions of the willing across national boundaries? Because while some of this can be done in domestic waters, and the government can say that the Thames Clipper on the Thames just outside this window has to go electric, catch up with Norway who've got 100, that's a very narrow impact on this huge industry. And one of the other challenges, and I'll end my layman's insights, is that I think shipping is one of those industries, like tourism, which I spent some time in, where people only notice it when it isn't there, because it's out of sight. It's not out of mind of the people around this room, but it's quite difficult to get populaces really excited about this stuff. They assume that all the food will arrive in the normal way. And I think if this is going to cost money, and part of it is going to be tax-driven, governments will want to be able to have reasons why taxes, if not hypothecated, although that seems to be a rule that's just been broken in this country, or at least nominally, if not hypothecated, an explanation of why we're spending a lot more on this stuff and what it means for you, for the general public, is going to be desirable. So, enough from me. Can we start with decarbonisation? And I'm going to do this round the table and then we'll start to get more interactive. But Jonathan, would you, as an operator with long practical experience, what are you looking, as you look forward, what does decarbonisation mean for MSC? So,
I mean, it's the biggest strategic challenge we're facing as a group, as an industry, and that's whether it's the cargo interest or the cruise interest. If I focus perhaps on the cruise side, for us, there's a consumer pressure for decarbonisation as well as a regulatory pressure and everything else. If people are going on holiday, they're very aware of the carbon footprint already. So that's an additional imperative for us, and it's shaping our thinking as we look ahead. And we have a significant new building programme at MSC Cruises. We've got many ships coming in the next 18 months and more beyond. And those ships that will be on the water now, we want still to be in some kind of operating capacity in 2050. So, the issue of it is tomorrow. There needs to be a real sense of urgency around the decarbonisation issue. I think the challenge is, we all know there's there's so many different facets to this argument about what the future fuels will be, what technologies will be required to make this work. And we focus clearly around this table with our shipping minds, but we know this is about the whole supply chain. This is, end-to-end, the production of new fuels, how those move across the land to get to the ships and then operate on the ships. Listened to a lot of discussion about this topic over the course of this week. It's fascinating. There's clear passion, there's strong feelings. I think from an MSC perspective, we don't know the answer yet, and we think it's probably wrong to back any one particular horse at this moment, but we need to look at investing and researching, as aggressively as possible, as many options as possible. And I think maybe just to close, it may be that there isn't a one-size-fits-all answer, and I think coming back to the point you made, operating a short sea ferry or a river clipper where you can potentially get batteries on board, but trying to, the battery load to manage one of our cruise ships is colossal, and that technology doesn't exist yet. So there may be different solutions, and that creates additional challenges and opportunities, because it may be that there's additional supply chains. It's not one bunker barge that can deliver to one ship and that's the end of the story. There'll be different fuels potentially needed in the ports and to be produced. So that's some initial comments from an operator's perspective.
So a couple of points that come out in addition to the urgency. The fact that we haven't got the decision right clear yet, and it may be in different things for different operators. Brian, I'll ask you, you've been doing some work on the choices ahead, and I know that one of the things you've been looking at is that it's not just a simple question of is the fuel available and how much is it? It's much broader than that. Would you just lay out a framework for us?
Yeah, I guess a couple of thoughts on this one really. The first thought is I'm not sure the choice of fuel is going to end up as a technology innovation issue. I think what I see, and as I talk to people, I think there's increasing consensus on is that engine technology to burn whatever it is, whether it's fuel cells or engines, will sort itself out. There's a load of research going on and it will come to whatever the right conclusions are. I think there's some fundamental challenges around all of the endpoint fuels that one might consider for decarbonisation. It's a relatively small suite. They're all suite of options: hydrogen, ammonia, potentially nuclear. It's a relatively small suite of options. They're all very difficult in their own way, and they all change the nature of shipping in quite a big way, because any of those options mean if you have an incident on board a ship, big incident, it has potential to affect quite a wide area. So suddenly, as a shipping sector, we need to start thinking about safety and security thresholds in ports, and I sort of suspect a lot of the choice of fuels and the thinking is going to happen at that port-ship interface. So it's not the only factor, but I think one of the hurdles that fuel choices are going to have to get through is that safety security threshold. I think it's helpful for us also to be thoughtful as we're talking about new fuels, to be much clearer. Jonathan rightly talked about short-range shipping probably having wider choices in terms of solutions, longer-range shipping probably having a narrower set of options. So we should be clear as we're talking about fuel options, whether we're talking short-range or long-range shipping. And we should be, I think as a sector, it would help as we're discussing things to be clear about whether we're talking about endpoint solutions or transition solutions. So I suppose those would be my thoughts, Christoph.
Which I think leads naturally on to Richard, from your perspective.
Yes, so from my perspective, I think we need to be, I agree with the comment about being clear on what problem you're solving, because I think without that, the conversation just goes in multiple directions, and I don't think we make progress. I think we do need to be able to strip out this difference between optimization and innovation on one hand. So there's an innovation that needs to happen, and this needs to happen on land-based and the ship-based and the ship side of things. Because I think if you start to look at optimization, there are a lot of things that you can do today that you can demonstrate clear progress, and a lot of progress has been made, and I think it's an important point to make. So as an industry, a lot has been done, and a lot can be done in the shorter term with the existing ships. It doesn't solve the whole problem, but we don't need to solve everything overnight. I think the progress can be made on optimizing the existing fleet, and in parallel, you can run these innovation projects to ensure that collectively, you have an impact in terms of total carbon reduction.
Brilliant. So the point is, one of the points is this is a journey.
Yes.
And one of the things that would be interesting to hear your views on is, as a shipping industry, how do you stay on the right side of the narrative? The airline industry completely lost the plot when the first issues about fuel and airlines came out. They made considerable progress. But can we talk perhaps about, from Graham, from your broad perspective, how do these strands come together, and what does it mean for the UK?
Yeah, I think if I think this at the very kind of, if I start at the very highest level, I mean, this is not a shipping issue, it's a societal issue. And this, which has come about because of the Industrial Revolution, followed by globalization, and everything that came with that. So the world benefited because, to a large extent, then people's livelihoods in large parts of the world have improved, and then you move to this phase where actually people wanted things cheaper, which then kind of drove the economics out to the Far East, So what we need to solve is a supply chain issue, not a shipping issue. And I think that's really important. And it's interesting that the World Economic Forum, I think, they've initiated a program where they're really looking at the supply chain in its entirety, with a view to trying to come up with mechanisms whereby those who benefit the most, and I would argue Apple or people like that, actually, from the efficiencies of the supply chain, they actually contribute more to the decarbonisation than those who are at the other end of the supply chain, who are deploying massive capital to actually meet the demands. So I think there's very much a broader aspect to that. But nevertheless, I think shipping needs to play its part. I'm absolutely sure that it will, and I'm absolutely sure that it can. I've lived through various legislation around SOx and NOx, et cetera, and and it's proven doable. It hasn't always been as simple as people would like, but I think my major point is we need to have a dialogue which actually is inclusive. And we need to create these coalitions of the willing to try and optimize the supply chain. And then I think legislation and financial mechanisms need to be developed which actually encourage the right behavior and reward that in the appropriate way. So that's a very broad answer, but I think it's important that we don't just say it's shipping. Shipping will play its part, I have absolutely no doubt. And my final point would be, as an ex-seafarer, everything that is developed and actually, new equipment or the new processes or new legislation ends up on the ship. And I sometimes miss the discussion around the actual impact on the seafarer at the front end, who it all flows down, So that debate needs to come to the fore as well. So apologies, Christopher.
Nothing to apologise for. I think the seafarers would be, if they're listening, will be cheering, having a discussion where the seafarers' interests and considerations are on the table, which they clearly are. This was a nice bet on past the financial.
It was. I was just going to pick up on what Graham said, because David and I sort of represent the stick, as it were. And Jonathan mentioned at the start, and Graham mentioned again there, the idea that shipping might do this itself. Cutting carbon is in and of itself a good thing. And so you could sort of have this interesting idea that if we just left shipping to it, would it do it? Now, the reality is, anyway, you went on to say, probably what we need to do is have financial rewards / punishments, depending on which way we look at it. And clearly, if you're a government, why trust people to do it? You don't need to. So, one of the things we know for sure is that somewhere along this line there is a tax charge. We call it, it might not be a tax charge as we understand it, but there's a tax, there's a levy, there's something coming. No one is going to trust shipping to do this itself, and even if it did, there's probably incentives for governments to tax it anyway. Now, what that looks like, I think is probably something we'll come on to talk about later on, but the reality is tax or charges are going to be a stick that is going to be used against shipping at some point soon.
I'm going to turn to David in a second, but I have a particular question out of that. This is not a single country unilateral. I mean, we're dealing with domestic waters. We can give Sean Collins a benefit for turning the Clippers electric. Yeah. But given that it's taken as long as it has for Sunak and the other finance ministers to agree of a global tax, and that's not yet delivered.
Well, it's
how is that?
The global taxing is the global taxing is really interesting. But to go back a step there, shipping is an controversial insight. Shipping is an international polluter. It's not so easy to say where is this pollution. If you've got your coal power station, you know where it's doing it. It's very easy for the UK government to deal with its own domestic pollution, if we can use that phrase. Shipping just doesn't fit within each country's approach. And the issue that we're seeing now with all of these different approaches to it is, who's got the right to tax that ship that might be flagged here, owned here, operated here. It just doesn't fit very comfortably in. And you can really draw a very nice analogy with global taxation, that shipping has managed to sort of carve out this niche to say, oh no, we shouldn't really be within your tax system or your tax system. We're an international business and we sort of float around the seas without being taxed. Now, again, wouldn't it be wonderful if that applied environmentally? I don't think that's going to work. But there is clearly a role to play. Someone has to take the lead in sort of saying, well, okay, where does shipping fit in with all of these domestic measures?
And sorry, if I may,
Please.
to that point, I think you mentioned about opportunities for the UK. There is an opportunity for the UK to help influence and drive that global discussion, because the point Richard makes is very true, and we don't want a fragmented global approach, because for us as an operator trying to manage a different regime when we're coming on a cruise where you might call 6 or 7 different countries in the space of a week, how am I going to, which regime am I doing on Tuesday and which one on Thursday? So we want a global approach, and that applies to our cruise business and to the cargo business. And I think there is a role for the UK to play in help driving that discussion. If we listen to the energy and the debate and the brilliant minds that have been talking over the course of this week around the table, that's an opportunity for the UK to help drive and shape that discussion at the IMO and in other bodies as well. So that's a plea from the operators, because we don't want a fragmented, broken approach and we can see it coming. So please, it's another urgency.
Well, our predecessors built a maritime history and a maritime reputation. This is an important part of global Britain. And it doesn't just have to be goods and services, it can be intellectual leadership.
Absolutely.
But I guess what goes with that, and then we'll come to David, is we want Boris to say not too much, but the right thing at COP26. I mean, if we can persuade, if you're listening, Boris, I think it's unlikely, but if you are, if it gets back to you, lead the coalition of the willing, get this out of the starting block, and we might make some progress. But if we can do this in the UK, but we're not really interested in the challenges in other countries, we'll have a half-baked solution, and one that takes much longer to arrive, if at all. On that optimistic note, David.
Crumbs. There's a lot of points to pick up on there. I think that let's pick up on something that Graham said about the World Economic Forum. And one of the other things that has been going on there is dealing with reporting around a whole range of things that, and I'm going to get the pronunciation of societal wrong. Actually, maybe I got it right. So that type of reporting, I think, clearly there are standards being developed there. And I think probably sort of if you look at the way when Jonathan mentioned consumers, consumers, investors, financiers, they're all now expecting a lot more reporting in a much more rigorous way. And we're going to see more evolving standards on that type of reporting. And if you look at a UK listed company, I think it does a lot of reporting at the moment and is held to account on a whole range of different measures, and those measures are just getting more stringent, I would say. So talking to sort of some of the clients in shipping that might be sort of, maybe they're listed in the US, maybe they're sort of not listed at all, then actually the standards of what they're reporting might not be, in all cases, as rigorous. So as customers of those shipping companies, whether it's an oil company, whether it's a manufacturer moving goods, they're all under the same pressures as sort of shipping companies to lower their carbon footprints, etc. So they're going to be looking to put tension into the supply chain to make sure that they're not only getting a good deal from, and a cheap price for moving the goods, but they're also going to want to know that, rather like they have with, say, things like anti-bribery and corruption type things, they're going to want to know that their suppliers and their shipping companies are actually doing the right thing as well. So I think you'll see sort of quite a lot of pressure put into the system that way. And will that mean that they sort of turn down a low-cost shipping company that is not using an environmentally friendly fuel to one that is using a sort of a decarbonised fuel? Well, and that's going to affect their price. Maybe in the short term that's a bit ambitious, but I think that that's the sort of thing that's going to happen. And you've seen it happen in other areas of regulation in shipping, etc. So those are the type of questions that consumers, I think, are going to be asking of the shipping companies and also investors. And and actually, it's not just investors; it's employees as well, because sort of when I look at an organisation like EY, sort of making commitments to carbon neutrality, I sort of think, well, why would we do that? And clearly, we do it because it's the right thing to do, but also we're doing that because people these days want to join companies that they see as being, sort of doing the right thing for the environment. So I think that the societal pressures are going to be immense on people to do things. But then I come back to what Richard says and sort of says that, I would just say to Richard, generally speaking, I don't tax my clients. But Richard's right in that sort of governments are going to that they like encouraging people to do the right thing, but also, people are people, so sometimes we need a bit of a sort of push in the right direction. And
my mother used to say you get more with honey than vinegar, so it's kind of...
Yes, yeah, I mean, yes, I've been told that on many occasions. And
sticky carrot was the answer. The sticky carrot.
Yeah. So I think that sort of it's inevitable that sort of and if you're a shipping company that is doing the right thing and making moves to decarbonise, and that is going to cost, and you need to pass that cost on to your customers in some form or other, because you've got to make your return on capital, then actually, if there's somebody who isn't doing as much as you, then you're probably going to turn around and say, well, actually, the company that is decarbonising needs to get some sort of benefit. Now, that can be a benefit because the government hands them money, or it could be a benefit because actually the other guy is stuffed with a cost that he then has to pass on as well. And I think actually it seems to me, sort of watching the sort of the news over the last week, is that shipping companies are sort of beginning to sort of now see more competitive advantage in actually sort of taking steps to publicly decarbonise and to make these statements. And there'll be some companies that make those statements and they'll get some credit in some way, one thinks. And there'll be other companies that sort of are slower, and maybe those companies that are slower will find that sort of there's a financial disadvantage to that at some point.
I'll just ask one question off that, and then Richard, come to you. How do you stop a portion of the industry doing a race to the bottom?
Well, I think that's exactly where I think that the stick has to come in. To be honest, I think that sort of if you looked at say the EU Fit for 55 measures that came in, the sort of announced, and the companies that there's going to be a price on carbon within the EU for international shipping, and that will make it sort of the companies that can deliver a lower carbon footprint and have the right sort of fuels will pay less carbon price than companies that don't. So you've got
to work on both ends.
You've got to
incentivise the willing and penalise the unwilling.
Unfortunately, I think that's the way the politicians and the regulators, I think, will see things.
But it is a question of putting a price on ESG. Once you start to price that, then that will create the types of behaviour that you really need. So.
The read-back to CSR reporting, which came much before ESG.
Yeah.
I mean, when that started, everyone said it wasn't going to happen, and within a decade, we were all doing it.
I'd like to stay with the carrot and stick, because I think they are both needed, and they serve slightly different purposes. But I do think what's changing things a little bit is data and digitalization, because once you can hold up the score, it changes everything. So I do think that a lot of people are underestimating the role that's going to play in this, because as soon as you start ranking the different actors in this, it's going to become fairly clear up the supply chain. I mean, we've experience of that from RightShip, right? So a greenhouse gas rating, A to G on the ships, or the safety score is actually beginning to directly affect the charter decision. So that appeals probably to the carrot end of the equation. And then for those that, or don't want to respond to that, there's always the stick.
And I guess taking that a little bit further, in terms of immediate actions and things that could have an impact, developing a really common vocabulary and set of definitions that everyone's working to would allow some of that comparison. I think that you're suggesting would be really helpful in stimulating the right behaviours.
Yes.
I mean, it's interesting. The EU are working on a taxonomy around the kind of the ESG, and again, it's back to your point, really, John. That if we have a regional taxonomy with different definitions and interpretations of the data, then it's a real mess, and you end up actually driving the wrong type of behaviour. So it's so important to shipping to have global interpretation and regulation.
It's an interesting, I have no shipping experience, but have an amount of travel industry experience. And the Davos work on travel and tourism, which had a set of issues, different but important, identified a number of key pillars and then ranked countries. And the cut-through we had in the UK with Cameron was when he found out the government's attitude to tourism was down with Sao Tome in the bottom 5 out of 130 countries. Changed quite quickly.
Tends to focus the mind when you know where you are. But Graham's made a great point, because I think if you look at the number of ESG standards out there, the last time I looked, there were roughly 30 of them, and in all of the different metrics and everything. If you're running an organization as a chief executive, you can't be focused on 50 KPIs or 50 metrics. So I think there needs to be a rationalization of those. And I do think also there needs to be a discussion about what's appropriate. Just because you can measure something, it doesn't mean you should be tracking it, and that should be the metric that you deploy.
Do you have a emerging preference for the 3 metrics or 5 metrics we should be using?
I think we, coming back to your earlier point about pace, right? I think we do need to begin to separate these two things, and let's talk about what we can do in the near term and should be doing in the near term and can be proud of and can actually measure and manage. The existing fleet. So let's do something there. There's no reason not to. And then, of course, in parallel, you can run with all of the other innovations which need to happen, but are, as Graham's pointed out, really supply chain issues. They're not so much shipping issues, and a lot of it's shore-based infrastructure, where a lot of investment needs to take place. But I think we are missing a trick as an industry in being able to demonstrate the good things that are being done. And I think if we focus our attention a little bit more there and track those metrics, we might be able to save more carbon than we think in the near term. And that's not going to solve the whole problem, but it contributes to the solution.
How, in people's experience internationally, how far has understanding of the supply chain versus shipping issue got, and A, within the industry, but B, within the governments and the regulators? Please, Grant.
Yeah, I would say very little until probably the last few months, and I think it's and
35 minutes actually.
yeah, but it was you know, and I think there's, but you know, I would also say within shipping generally, you know, there was a period when I was chairman of Intertanko, and which is some time ago now. And that was when MBM started first to be talked about, and it was just, you know, everybody kind of hid under the table, or, you know, it wasn't a debate that anyone wanted to have. And this is 7 or 8 years ago. But I think there's a general acceptance now by the industry that we need MBMs, we need to put a price on carbon, and now please hurry up and do something, someone, on an international basis. I think that would be my take. So I think we now have a willing shipping industry largely to be able to do this. I think the other thing which is really interesting to me, and kind of in various debates I've had this week, is will the consumer pay? Because the best option would be if consumers actually, if you put a price on carbon, for instance, but then he has an iPhone with an app and he goes on Amazon and the price of a pair of Nike trainers is X, but the carbon footprint or the carbon cost is Y, but he could have a cheaper pair, or he could have he had a choice to make. Yeah. Would they make the right choice? Because ultimately, if people make the right choices, that will ease this transition into the carbon-free world. But you know, as long as people go on to Amazon and kind of say, I want something tomorrow morning, and there's an extra charge on that, they pay it, but there's no transparency around the carbon footprint associated with that particular pair of trainers.
There's a nice tax analogy there, isn't there? If we sort of think back, it used to be the case that sort of a company's tax position was no one's business. And then that's changed, and it's increasingly changing. And suddenly, you know, Starbucks is in the news because, to use the Guardian language, you know, they're not paying their fair share. I suspect there was, when those stories were running around, quite a significant hit at Starbucks. People might go to Costa rather than to Starbucks because of these stories. Now, you know, if we wander outside, there's still Starbucks, right? So it's a question of how long that lasts for you. There's clearly an impact. Whether that's a long-lasting impact or not, I don't know. To pick up on something Martin said before, and again, there's another tax thing. And I'm sure David's had this experience as well, shipping sort of generally, as a global industry, isn't really a taxed industry at all. But the thing that makes companies look at their tax structure is suddenly when they've been denied access to an opportunity because of their tax structure. So the more that happens, and again here, there must be an analogy there that if you're denied access to a customer, a project, whatever it may be, because of your environmental impact, that is bound to get people's attention.
And we see that already. In the cruise sector, we see that already. There are ports already trying to impose certain restrictions and so on, but you won't be able to come here unless you meet certain criteria. So it really is driving the behaviour of the operator.
And it's a decision to change or to go somewhere else.
And that's the operator has that, but the consumer at the end of the day is the one who's going to pick their cruise itinerary. If they want to visit Port A, really, because they will go up a particular fjord, and that's the only line that can go up there, that will drive behaviours as well. So there is a real-life analogy today in shipping with that. If I may just come back to your point about the supply chain as well, because again, listening to lots of the commentary over the course of this week, and the role that shipping has to play in telling its own story, whether it's saying, you know, we have been doing things for quite some time, actually, not, you know, this isn't, you know, we have been thinking about this, we continue to think about this in an aggressive way, but it hasn't really been communicated well. And that's shipping, we all know this has never been great at its communication and helping people understand really what a fantastic job it does in terms of, you know, the numbers you hear every day about the percentage of world trade that moves by sea in the UK, how dependent we are upon the trade flows in and out by sea. The stories that we're all hearing now, if you need to buy your children Christmas presents, can I suggest you buy them now because of the problem? We don't know what it's going to be like at Christmas time. And who's to think that the fact that there's a container in the Suez Canal that's going to then impact me getting my garden furniture delivered on time? That's bringing an awareness in maybe a negative way. So shipping has a role to play in promoting itself and being more positive. And again, maybe there's a UK angle to that in terms of, as that maritime nation, it's got a profile, respected around the world to be able to push the shipping positive agenda and the good things that have been happening and will continue to happen as we look ahead.
Yeah, I mean, just back to the UK angle, which you kind of asked me about earlier, and I didn't respond to really. But but my wife says I'm like that all the time, so it's kind of just so it's not personal.
Public admission to being unresponsive.
Yeah. So the one thing the UK has that's pretty unique is it probably has more expertise in breadth and depth than any other country in terms of the banks, shipping, the tax, the legal arbitration, the technical, operational. There's a massive amount of expertise that still resides in this country, and so when you think about addressing a problem, which is wider than we actually have the people that could sit around the table as we are today and really identify the areas that need to be addressed and bring them forward. So the COP26 provide, and I'm not sure whether shipping will get a mention by Boris, in case he's listening, of course. But it's an opportunity to actually create that, to explore an opportunity of the UK pulling together the coalition of the willing, the expertise that's required. So, which is what you've said, mentioned earlier. So it's just an interesting thing.
I do agree strongly with Graham. Actually, I think the more we, I think, talk about this being really massive system change and for maritime and talk about the breadth of that change, and I do think the UK's got a lot of the intellectual capital to figure out how to make the whole system alter. We do small parts of the system around regulation, but it's going to change beyond measure, and there's a part around port regulation in the future which is in no way fit for purpose for introduction of some of these new fuels. That's just a tiny microcosm of the whole thing. I really think that is where some of the advantage for the UK potentially is.
So, Christopher, you alluded to that in your opening remarks about joined-up thinking, and so I echo that. But I think also one of the things that we sometimes fall foul of is trying to solve the whole problem at once for every event, for every type of trade. And I think there has to be a realization that shipping is effectively, they're floating assets, but they're operating in different markets. And I think until we begin to try to solve these things almost segment by segment, I don't mean about regional solutions, but there needs to be a solution for short sea. There needs to be a solution for cruise, maybe for bulk, for tankers, for container ships. That might look slightly different, and that's okay. Because ultimately it's got to serve that business and it's got to serve the stakeholders that business is serving. And there might be access to different fuels or different technologies or different options. That shouldn't mean we should wait for the last person in the convoy, right? Let's do what you can today. And there's a great example of that sort of thinking was through the sort of the Norwegian Green Coastal program, right? So finding out what is the biggest contributor and then trying to work out how do you address that in sequential form. I think that's that's something to be said for that, and stop trying to find the one answer for global shipping because it doesn't exist as far as I can see.
So if you do a sort of national scorecard, you say focus on the three things that are going to make the biggest difference, and then the journey starts. There's a again, my non-maritime experience. I used to run a company called Visa, and Visa is a global cards which we all use. Were created without any intervention from government. And what's interesting is in Britain, we all think that the industry is about credit cards, because we remember Barclaycard we still do with them, Barclaycard and Access. The lesson that's exactly your point is that the debit card, which we now all use and is much bigger than credit cards, started out as a local market and regional solution. And then they glued the multiple regional solutions together. But it got going.
And get the demonstrators going, you know, get the equipment on board the ships, get the training going. Yeah. And I think a role for governments can be, you know, sort of beyond, let's say, you know, trying to solve this problem internationally and cross borders, because governments struggle with that, you know, looking to their own constituents and their own countries. But there are things that can be done to get these demonstrator projects funded, or to support the capital of those to bridge that gap, get them running, you know, get them operational. And there's no reason why that can't be done, you know, in the same way as it was done in Norway. And that also stimulated the innovation and the manufacturing industry behind it.
Isn't that sort of it's a leadership problem, isn't it? So if you look at the problem at the moment, you could sort of look at it from a corporate point of view. We've got lots of divisions of this great big company putting forward this is how we should do it, this is how we should treat our division. And we've got our shareholders who are, you know, everyone else, but we don't have a board. We forgot to appoint a board of directors to this thing. Yeah. So there's, you know, short sea shipping might have a great idea, but who says yes, do it? Or who, you know, that's it. There's that sort of management bit at the top just isn't there.
Perfect story. I mean, Steve Jobs and the skunk works mindset, and he then goes, I mean, they had other things beside iPhones, but someone went, that is what we're going to do. Yeah. And you need the skunk works. Yeah. You need the innovation.
I don't know who that board. That's the, you know, I don't know who is that board of directors. I don't know the answer.
It's a great question, because we actually, if you think about the IMO, as we all know, is a governing body, but it's only the governing body for shipping, and this is a supply chain issue. So and that's the Achilles heel of IMO. So they do many great things, but what we're asking them to do is what is largely a political body with a technical bias to solve a commercial issue. You know,
perfect.
And you're right. We somehow need to figure. You know, the governments of this world, whoever it is, need to figure out how to provide real leadership and clarity, and then on a global basis that allows people to actually do the right thing.
I mean, you talked about the market-based measures, and Jonathan was, you said you wanted a global solution. So, and if the IMO is that, it's quite interesting to think, well, if the IMO is going to have a fund, and is the IMO suddenly a taxing body? Because I'm sceptical, to be honest, that countries will, you know, allow an organisation like the IMO to be effectively a taxing body.
I'm sure they will.
And you know, whereas going back to the global tax reform, what that's done is almost and I think it's actually I'll disagree with you. I think it's coming quite remarkably fast compared with any other taxation change in the world that there's ever been. You know, I think the changes have, you know, it's only what BEPS, you know, 1.0. It's only taken about 5 years from it being announced to being implemented and having real effect. And I think the latest round is going to come in very quickly as well. So I think it's actually happened remarkably fast. But I can't see so if there is going to be a global market-based measure, then you need some way of divvying out that fund and making sure it's and that is a political that's an intensely political thing and sorry,
DFID too.
Yeah, and I think the other thing there is that the countries that are have got loads of ships on their flag aren't necessarily the countries that you're seeing where the emissions are taking place and where you need the solutions, and they're not even necessarily where the economic ownership of the ships are. So I think you've got some fundamental problems with that, and I think that sort of that's why I think the EU is doing what it's doing. One of the reasons is that it fits in with the rest of the EU economy, which actually goes to sort of Martin's, and other people's points that this is a sort of societal issue. It's about the supply chain, and I think that's almost what the EU is saying, is that, well, actually shipping is just part of the supply chain. It's not special in that case, and that's why it needs to be sort of dealt with as part of the supply chain. I think that's very much the EU's point of view. I look at this and I think, God, it'd be very easy just to stare at the problem and think that's just too big. Let's not do anything because it's too big. But I think it is really important to take these bite-sized chunks where you can. And I'm not sure that all of my shipping clients have necessarily done all of the things that they could do to optimize the operational efficiency of the ships that they have. I'm not sure that they're investing in the ports to get the sort of the port shoreside supplies of electricity and things that they could be doing. So we talk about sort of this is going to cost a lot, but there's a lot of the decisions on capital allocation that you can take today. Do I go out and buy a brand new spanking ship, or do I actually just improve what I've got? Now, obviously, the supply chain, well, it turns out it isn't as resilient as we thought it was, and we need more ships by the, sort of from it looks like. So, we've got to sort of do both, but this is partly a capital allocation issue, and I'm not sure that sort of that adjustment has necessarily happened everywhere yet.
Sorry. Yeah. I think I have to challenge you a little bit here, David. And
good.
In terms of optimization of assets,
Yeah.
The economics of a voyage are very much one of the basic economics of a voyage are dictated, are fuel-driven. So it's in every owner's best interest to actually reduce fuel as much. And I can't think of many owners who don't do that. I'm sure there's some who are just pure asset players, want to be in and out, but the large majority, I would suggest the very large majority of owners are responsible in terms of really thinking about how to optimize their assets because it's in their best interests too. You raise another point which I'm kind of...
Can I just interrupt that on that, though?
Sure.
That's assuming that a certain carbon price. And what I'm saying is that sort of are there investments that you could make that you are not making today because the price of carbon is zero? And if you put a price of carbon that is, $200 a ton of CO2, are you suddenly going to reevaluate whether you sort of, you improved, sort of the performance of the ship by reducing the drag on the hull through, or putting a sail on something? And I just wonder whether sort of, if you put a price on carbon, whether people will be more innovative operationally.
I'm not disputing that. What I am disputing is the fact that people are not optimizing.
No, what I'm saying...
You're suggesting, David, changing the optimisation.
I'm saying that...
Yes.
You're saying, Graham, actually it is quite...
You're saying
the sector's quite good at figuring out the optimisation
Exactly.
given a set of parameters.
Yes, and I'm saying we're going to
parameters.
change the parameters. We put a price on carbon, and then people will innovate more to increase the operational...
I have one other point, if I just made it, and then I'll shut up on that. Why should owners invest in ports? Why should they do that? I mean,
well, in the cruise industry, owners already invest in ports, and so they do in the container line industry.
But just in, they do, but in general, on a much wider scale, especially in making ports greener.
Well, it seems to me that you're either going to either the port is going to invest, or the shipper, the shipping company, the owner is going to have to pay more import charges, to enable the port to carry out those improvements. But I think Jonathan's probably...
I think I'm going to use the word that was used, that some of us participated in an event this morning where the word collaboration was used. Yeah. And I think there will be different types of collaboration depending on where the location is and the volumes of activity that are going through it. And in some cases there will be dedicated people who are interested only in the shoreside, but they're still going to have to work with the shippers, because the ships will bring the cargoes to and from the port, or the passengers to and from the port. And if we look at the experience, MSC's investing in various locations. We're investing in a terminal in Miami at the moment. Why are we doing that? Because we see that as a kind of way of us working more closely with the local market and facilitating. It's in our interest because we can move passengers more efficiently through the terminals, improve the passenger experience and so on. But also have access to the shoreside infrastructure and the shore power. We do engage with various participants in the shore power sector, and again, but there's a lot of work. Shore power and connecting the ship to the shore when she comes in is a topic in its own right that we could probably spend a considerable amount of time discussing, because that's not quite as simple as it sounds at first hearing as well. So I think. But the point is, I do think there needs to be some collaboration, cooperation at that point, because that's where the ship does touch the shore, and that's a critical point of the process. David, you raised a very interesting point about the economics of, and I think I'll act as the middleman. I agree with Brian that I think that there's evidence for both of you. So if I look back to when the fuel price was really high, at various times. Owners do look at different types of technologies and so on that would become a bit far-fetched when the price is not such an economic imperative. The development of paints or types of new propellers and all these kind of interesting new technologies that have a significant investment cost. Well, if there's an economic case to do it because the price is this, rather than, sorry, I'm waving my arms around, I don't know if people can see what I'm, it will drive decisions. And if the price is lower, then there may be less of a case. You could talk about shale oil and things as another example of that. So I think that economics, there is still, economics will drive some of these decisions.
Exactly. But I think the point a number have made about this, the need to sort of start eating the elephant one bite at a time. And Martin, you made the point about pilot projects, but the very strong point you've made, Graham, about the supply chain, and Jonathan, you're talking about that ship-shore interface. That whole question of how do you create these collaborations, these coalitions between that, where we do implement some pilots, some early changes, we must do those across the system, and particularly get the port-ship interface right, because that is a tough thing to get right. And it would be wrong just to do those pilots, those changes on the ships themselves, because the ships are only part of the equation, as you've said very strongly, Graham.
I reckon if we had a word cloud this week and we put it up, probably collaboration would be one of those that would be fairly big. And I think one of my bugbears is what I'm missing is executable collaboration. So collaboration I think is fine, but we need to align our interests, and the way to align the interest is to think about the whole supply chain and the underlying business and which stakeholders and customers they're serving. Just to pick up a point that was made earlier in terms of sort of global carbon markets, I think most people are not very hopeful that this is going to happen. And that's probably going to bring you towards sort of the carbon offsetting or even the carbon insetting option, where you actually are rewarded for putting that technology, not only from a sort of a pure cost driver perspective, but when you start to price the total cost of carbon, that will help things move. So in terms of that, can you identify areas where you can actually invest something, demonstrate the saving of the carbon, and begin to line everything up? And you can show that to your shareholders, stakeholders, and the communities you serve. I think that's a credible way forward.
I mean, the thing that goes hand in hand with, if I understand it right, is there's a key role, and it's possibly for government or agency bodies like ours to start to frame the discussion sensibly, and more importantly, the execution. Because
and
you can do everything to everyone at all times.
Yes.
Yeah. And so the framing, which isn't terribly exciting, because governments don't like to announce that they've framed something. You don't get very many brownie points. But that's exactly what you're all talking about. Now, look, I let decarbonisation run for an hour for the reason that it actually brought up the framing issues that go into other areas. So can we now do a sort of quicker canter through? Otherwise, we'll autonomously shut you down. Increased automation, much talked about. Increased data, really important. What's the prognosis for automation and its impact on the industry? Anyone want to start with that?
I'm happy to start on that because it's you know, I've read a lot about it, but the reality is this has been happening as far back as I can remember. When I joined ships, then actually originally we had manned engine rooms, you know, and we had 40, 50 people on a ship. You know, now we've got unmanned engine rooms, unmanned machinery spaces. We've got 15 people on a ship, or 15, 20, whatever it is. And so this is just what I believe is a natural progression. I think I'm not sure I'll see a fully autonomous ship in my lifetime, but then I'm older than most, so it's others may see that happen. So what I do think and what I do worry about are two things. Really, one is the reliability of equipment that actually comes into the marine sector isn't all it should be. So I do worry about that, and I can make a swift comment on that, which is probably somewhat controversial. But but if I think about the development of equipment over the years, it's been some of it around the meeting legislative requirements, oily water separators, ballast water management systems, to name but just two, were actually developed to meet regulation that was developed by the IMO. And it was developed in the knowledge that operators would buy it because they had to meet the regulation. And therefore, ultimately, the IMO became the customer, in a way, you could argue, that as opposed to the actual operators. And so the equipment in the marine industry is not as reliable as it should be. And so that's something to talk a little bit about, potentially the enhanced risks associated with autonomy. I think the other thing that I worry about is, and I'll come back to the people issue, is really, if you go from 20 people now to 7 people in the future, you need a different skill set, so you need to think a little bit about that. But think about, you need to think about structurally how you employ and deploy people, because do you want to really be stuck with 6 other people for, we've all been through lockdown, I mean, my wife wanted me out within the first month, Now that may be an extreme.
She will send you back to sea.
Yeah, exactly. So the point being, it's very difficult. Look at there's potential for a very difficult environment and the mental well-being impact that might have on individuals. We can't forget about that. So.
It's hard to find a tax point for autonomy, but there is one there.
Now this is innovation.
Exactly. Watch this. So there's a big discussion. So tonnage tax obviously is important for the UK's maritime industry, hugely important. And within tonnage tax at the moment is a training commitment. And so there's a big discussion at the moment about what that's going to look like. And autonomy, is there an opportunity for the UK to be really I don't quite know how you train someone on an autonomous ship at the moment. They're not there. But is there an opportunity for the UK cadet training to sort of get ahead of the game a little bit there?
I think hugely. I think we've. I was lucky to be part of a skills commission looking at this, and it felt as if we're, as a sector, we're kind of, the officer training is kind of behind the curve of the development of the ships and the sector itself. And as the UK, we've got a great reputation in that area, but the change in automation that Graham's described, that evolutionary journey, which feels like it's accelerating, but also all the decarbonisation that we've talked about provides potentially a massive opportunity for the UK if we can if we can change the way that we train officers and gain acceptance and enthusiasm within the sector for that change. But if the international sector is going to have to go through the magnitude of changes that we've talked about today, there is going to be a market for gobsmackingly well, technically and leadership trained officers to effect that transformation. And the UK could be in a position where it can provide people to lead that.
First, I'd echo those points. I agree that's a real opportunity for the UK and development of the maritime skills and cadets, absolutely. And also, I'm going to echo your comments, Graham, perhaps not surprisingly, about automation. And yes, there'll be more automation in engine rooms and systems and so on. And Martin, you're absolutely right, the data flow, and there'll be much more, I mean, the volume of data, we're transmitting data to and from our headquarters in Uxbridge every second of the day to and from the fleet. We've got live data feeds of all sorts coming in from the ships, because it's vital to our operations, the safety of our passengers and crew. So, and that will help the digitisation. I know, again, another cloud, whatever you want to call it, this D squared, the decarbonisation, digitalisation, effectively, they're inherently linked. They need to work together, that data flow. I think the other point about, I mean, with my cruise hat on, we're a people business. That's what we do. We engage with guests, and the notion of having fully automated everything. We've tried. We have I have to be careful what I say here. We've put a robotic barman or bar person on our latest cruise ship. For those of you who've seen it, Robbie, I think it's Robbie the Robo Bar. But gender diversity. I think yes, we've gone neutral. But the. I think actually you'd still, if you're on holiday, you want to relax, you can have a social engagement with a member of our crew. They do a fantastic job, working. They contribute to the whole value proposition for us. So I think certainly with the cruise hat on, we can say we don't see full automation as being something we'll be running with.
Just do a quick check back on a broader point. How substantial, are there any things that we have not touched on that will fundamentally change the industry in the next 30 years?
The one thing that we haven't really talked about, and that might lead us a little bit into something else, is basically the availability of capital to the industry. There's going to be trillions of dollars of capital required in building, if it is for instance, hydrogen, then an infrastructure needs to be built out, and I'm not sure who's going to do that. It might be the energy companies, I don't know, but I do think these, and then back to the point you were making earlier, David, about ESG being a decider. Are the banks going to become? I think there's a Poseidon principles have been developed. Are the banks right now? I think it's a really good initiative. How much teeth it has, I'm not sure. It's certainly not global. So I do think that this capital issue is going to be really interesting. It'll be a fundamental part of this debate about how we get this done. So it's kind of. But I'm sure, David, you have a better.
Yeah, I mean,
perfect lead into.
Well,
money question.
You said what in the next 30 years? The industry's. I don't know. So when I talk to people, sort of about the other businesses that we advise, and so, I'm talking to my colleagues. I mean, the thing about shipping is that it's still got very significant private ownership, and secondly, it's very, very fragmented. So, and given the costs that we're now talking about going forward, I do wonder whether sort of we'll see the sort of more sort of I can't think of any other word other than collaboration now.
Unless you add implementation or execution somewhere in your sentence.
So I wonder whether we're just the barriers to entry might just get a bit higher. Whether we're going to see sort of more consolidation. That's the word I was looking for. Consolidation in the industry. Obviously, we've got very many different sectors within the industry. So, we'd be talking about consolidation probably by sector, etc. But I do wonder whether that's something that we'll see more of, because I think that if you're talking about raising these sort of sums of finance, and you're going to sort of need a lot more transparency and sort of and I think one of the other things is as I say, consolidation.
Jonathan, is there a new entrant versus established operator tension here? I mean, airline industry has been, everything you've just said has happened in the airline industry in the last 20 odd years, and suddenly Wizz Air has arrived as a new entrant because it had none of the legacy issues. Is that a relevant frame for us?
I think you should never rule out that possibility, because as soon as you rule out that possibility, you will find yourself in trouble. So I think it's naive to think that there won't be people who come in and challenge. Is there an alternative to waterborne transport for many things at the moment? Probably not. There will still be one thing. I'll probably go out and say yes. There will still be ships moving around the world's oceans in 20 years' time, or whatever the time frame is that we're looking at. But in terms of who might come in, there is always, particularly when you have a period like this of disruption, there is always the possibility for new entrants and new participants. We participated in the Clean Maritime competition and we were successful in our effort. We're working with a company that's never worked with maritime before in its output. And I think there will be new opportunities and new participants who see maritime for the first time and think, oh, we've got a technology or a skill that, or something that could be applied in that context. So I think everybody needs to be alive to that. I just want to come back to the financing, if I may, because again, I have some thoughts on that topic, as you might imagine. Again, like with the fuel solution or whatever, I don't think there's necessarily a one-size-fits-all solution. There will be a diverse capital base, and different requirements will be met by that diverse capital base. Yes, there's a very significant investment required. There's a big question about risk and who bears risk. As a ship owner operator, we're happy to bear commercial and operating risk around ships, because that's what we do and that's our business. But we're not fuel developers or anything. And we are having to make those decisions today. We've got an LNG ship, first LNG ship from the MSC fleet enters service next year. We've got one coming the following year. And we've had to take that position, and that was a decision taken some years ago. And then if I listen to some of the talk at some of the conferences, oh, you shouldn't be working with LNG, that's not the future anymore. Well, we've had to make that decision, and we will make it work. And then I think another point about that is that there will need to be flexibility in ship design to allow us to adapt the technologies. I wanted to talk very briefly about governance. We've talked a lot about the environmental piece. Probably not enough about the social, and again, I just want to say the crew are extremely important, and the welfare of crew is essential. But governance is something that, again, the UK has a role to play in the governance of shipping companies. And I've worked for a company that's owned by a family, and I've worked previously for a family-owned shipping company before that. Governance is actually important to the families or private companies as well, but there isn't one answer to everything. The private ownership allows you to adapt and respond and take decisions. One, you can respond more quickly than you can perhaps as a public company, and two, you can take a longer term view than potentially you can as a public company. So I think, again, we must keep in mind governance is really important, and everybody wants good. It's a bit like, why would I want bad governance? Why do I want to pollute? There's some fundamentals there, but there's solutions that will apply to everybody. It may be, though, if we need to find new capital to attract new capital, then you are going to have to think in a slightly different way, and there will be some challenges for some shipping companies in that sense. And I think the banks, the financial institutions, are already driving those behaviours. So I think that's something we can all expect to be something we work with going forward.
More on finance. I'm going to go last few minutes.
There's one thing that we've been talking a lot recently. So if you it's this tech investment. If you just think about the traditional tech investors, it's very much they're used to hit and miss. And if you think about a traditional shipping investor, couldn't be more different. So there's got to be at some point a sort of coming together of those two attitudes. And we've seen it over the past, 5 or 6 years. Private equity has invested in shipping. And again, when that started, they didn't mesh together very well. So private equity are thinking, well, I'm out in 5 years. And shipping are thinking, well, in 5 years, that might be the worst possible day to sell your ship. But they've found a way to sort of come together. And one of the interesting things that we expect to happen is that sort of the tech investor extreme, I'll make 20 investments and one will come off. Shipping has to sort of learn to somehow speak to those people and understand how they operate, you know. And the PA example is a good one. It's worked. When it first started, there were lots of people who thought that's not going to stop. But actually, they both learned to live with each other. So one of the things we're expecting is that shipping will learn to live with sort of this different language, frankly, that's spoken by tech investors.
Does that not, though, fundamentally affect the cost of capital?
Yeah.
So we've got to get used to potentially a different cost of capital.
Coming into this, I mean, obviously you've got a, forthcoming career in marriage counselling, or maybe bilingualism as a translator between these two worlds, as you explained. But I think the other area that pops up is in innovation. So you've got innovation; it's exactly the same sort of principle, right? It's fail fast, just throw a bunch of things and see if it works, right? And that's an absolute contrast to the traditional way we want certainty with everything. And I spent, sort of 3 years sort of managing those two different interests and trying to keep everybody engaged. And I think that's a danger. First of all, that the shipping industry is too insular and not accepting this kind of thing. And secondly, I think it's keeping the respect between these two different parties, which is it's a cultural thing, which needs work. So you want to bring this fresh thinking in. And you want to keep the domain knowledge, expertise, and the individuals that are running it that want certainty engaged. And that's not an easy task.
And just to, and I've always loved, and wherever I've been fortunate enough to have owners who want to invest in innovation and better ways of doing things. But the conservatism within shipping is inherent, and it's driven, by the past, because ships kept running aground, and when we go back to how many, if you look at the statistics, and I just happened to be early this week in the Royal Maritime Greenwich Museum, and Paddy Rogers showed me around. We talked about this type of thing. So, and the reality is, you can't afford, for some sectors, you can't afford to get it wrong. We know that, whether it's Costa Concordia, Torrey Canyon, Prestige, Erika, Herald Free Enterprise, and so forth and so on. So that drives a little bit of conservatism. So I'm not sure. I agree with you.
It's the conversation.
But it is a tension that sits within there, and the demands of that you have from the charterers, or if you're carrying their oil, or you're also carrying their reputation, doesn't necessarily encourage innovation.
We'll give it a go.
Yeah. But having said that, I'm absolutely on board that we should be doing things, but I'm just trying to talk a little bit about the fact that there is a resistance for good reason, I think. So
I completely agree. The important thing is to keep the domain experts connected, so that they're seeing eye to eye, and that's the difficult part, because you can't look at the safety, you can't compromise on the safety and other operating aspects, but it's keeping the two sides talking to one another, because otherwise you develop a piece of tech that's not joined up or particularly helpful or useful.
Coming to the end, which is probably encouraging for the panellists and maybe even more encouraging for those in the audience. Role of government and what you would like to see in the government in general, but in particular, what would you like the UK to do? And then I'm going to come to a last question around the table, which is, in the spirit of Martin, if there are 3 things that need to be done in the next 3 years, what would you pick? So, but role of government in this. Silence demonstrates you want them out of the way. I don't think they.
I'll stick. I can let me say a couple of things about the role of government. I think I didn't quite finish the financing piece before. So no, that's not at all. There is a potential role for government to help play close. There's this gap that needs addressing between the massive financial needs and where we are with technologies and everything else, the investments that's needed. So there's potentially a role for government to play in facilitating how we invest and deal with the considerable investment required in the new technologies and decarbonisation. So I think that's one piece, and I think a consistency of thinking is vital, and we've talked a little bit about that already. And I think probably the main things that we would look for, facilitate the work in partnership with industry to address these challenges ahead.
Anyone else got any? Want to add anything on government?
I'm not sure. I think the predictability is what the shipping industry needs that, and the reason it needs that is because when the ship owner deploys the capital, he's deploying it for 20 years. So it's kind of so it does need that. But I was just thinking, and I think David and Richard will know far more about this than I do. But if I look at the wind farm industry, there seem to be mechanisms that were put in place that encouraged development, and we all know that. I think the energy that was produced, and I don't, was initially very expensive, and then gradually so it created an environment where people were prepared to take the risk, invest for the longer term on the basis that they knew they would get a reward at the end of that. Exactly. So I think governments can put frameworks in place that really encourage that type of approach. But again, I don't know enough about the wind industry to be an expert. But it seems to me, looking from 30,000 feet, that somehow we if you believe in wind farms, and you can have different views on that, that it managed to create an industry that's delivered on what it was intended to do to a large extent. But
they were able to incentivise long-term investors by almost guaranteeing income, a certain electricity price at guarantee. Now, whether that fits very well for shipping, I'm not sure. From the tax side, I wrote down certainty, and that's what we hear time and time again from every tonnage tax. Everyone that's invested in tonnage tax, what they want to know is that it's going to stay. I'm not going to say stay the same, but it's going to stay. And there's an interesting sort of discussion at the moment that there is a hope and an expectation that tonnage tax will be changed, and by change I mean improved. So when we say certainty, we don't necessarily need to know that this is exactly what it's going to like in 10 years. What people want to know is that there is still going to be a tonnage tax, for example, that it's supported. Because like you say, it is that long-term view. People aren't interested in investing and then in 3 years' time finding it's changed. So whenever we get to sit opposite people from the revenue or the treasury, it's that certainty, and I think you use the word consistency. That's really what, that's what we say time and time and time again.
I think governments can contribute, but need to understand which problem is being solved by which instrument. So I think breaking this up into the domestic shipping and trying to join those things up, getting the road agency or the ship-shore interface correct and all of that lined up, but understand what problem you're solving and what instrument you're using to solve that problem, I think is very important. And don't get confused about all of the different aspects of shipping. For people that are outside the industry, they tend not to see the nuances of the different segments and trades, and I think you need to understand the underlying business. So if there's anything we can do as an industry to explain the underlying business in a better way or in a clearer way, I think, so that those people that are making the regulation understand that the common denominator is that the assets float, but that's roughly where it is. And they might be subject to the same jurisdiction, but the businesses are very different.
Yeah. Thank you. Can we do our 3 points as a wrap up? You started, would you like to finish?
I didn't start. Sorry, what was the question again?
Well, we've talked about execution.
Yeah.
What would be the 3 things you wanted real progress on in the next 3 years? They can be completed, or they be beginning a journey which is...
Well, my personal view is that shipping has been dancing around this question about the price of carbon for quite a long time now, and if we want to have the sort of right incentives and to deal with this certainty issue, then I think we need to sort of be able to see a sort of what pricing we're actually talking about over what time scale. And I think that if people knew that, then I think a lot of, you know, they don't need to know the details, but they need to know sort of, you know, how much is this going to, you know, sort of cost in terms of, then I think that it will be easier to do the sort of executable collaboration that people are talking about. So I think, to be honest, I think that that's the sort of, you know, sort of the one, you know, thing. And I think while there is uncertainty, then I think it's very difficult for people to sort of take, and clearly there's still going to be uncertainty over what fuel to go for and things like that. But when people go to, you know, through their governance processes and decide how to allocate capital, then you'll just get more capital coming into the system if you knew what the price was going to be and the time horizon for dealing with it.
Perfect. Quick answers, because we're running out of time.
Joined up thinking, we need to be, you know, coming back to Graham's points also about supply chain, right? We need to join this up, but we need to be thinking about technical, regulatory, political, and commercial. So otherwise, it's like trying to play music on a guitar that has only one string. You know, you need all four strings to, you know, to make this work. And I think that also leads you to a place where you can take some of the risk out of the execution side of it, because you've actually properly considered, you know, the full scope, and you may be priced in carbon as well. And then finally, I think we need to optimize what we have, and we need to get started now. Let's not wait for the answer. Let's just do what you can in your area or for your trade based on the business and the stakeholders you serve.
Brilliant. Brian?
Number one, create common language and definitions regarding carbon efficiency. Number two, get end-to-end pilots and demonstrations running, including supply chain, the whole thing. And number three, back that up with the early market intervention, whether that's domestic or coalitions of nations that are willing to work together on it, or broader than that, with a view to, within the end of the decade, having the endpoint solution defined so we can get on with implementing it.
Jonathan?
I mean, I'm going to say collaboration, coalitions, partnerships, whatever you want to, however you want to define it, and that's within all the stakeholders in maritime, but beyond as well, looking beyond the sphere, because I think you know, many of the solutions none of us may have thought of yet, and I think that's critical. Linked to that, then, are recognising there is not necessarily one solution to every one of the problems that we're facing. I think dividing them up and recognising there might be multiple solutions and maintaining as much flexibility as possible. But to David's point, we've got to get on with this. This is my last point. This commitment needs to be converted to action. We need some degree of certainties, whether it's around the carbon pricing or the measures, to be able to move ahead with some certainty.
I mean, David, I think, captured for me is if you get the, and he said it much more eloquently than I would, but basically, if you get the price of carbon right, that will create the dialogues and the discussions across the supply chain that you really want, and ultimately bring the relevant people together. And I worry about that, but we do need something that will create that certainty and that ability to have the right discussions on the commercial instruments that are required. And then I would say, don't forget the people.
I'm going to be perfectly selfish with mine. So a year ago, maybe 2 years ago, if you got given a time charter agreement, you did not have to worry about the carbon tax clause. Now you do have to worry about the carbon tax clause. And to follow David's point, a year ago it was probably 5 lines long. Now it might be 2.5 pages long as you try and pick every different one around the world which might apply to your ship. And it doesn't make me happy doing my job. So in 3 years' time, I would like that clause to have shrunk back to being 5 lines long, where we know what it is we're doing.
That'll be a first.
So, look, thank you all. That's been a miraculous hour and a half. I hope other people have enjoyed it. I've learned a lot, which was one of my objectives. Not 3 things to do, but 3 things that come out for me. One is the emphasis on now. If we don't start, given the life cycle of shipping, etc., this is never going to happen. The second is, and we've tried many ways of saying it, but coalitions, focus on execution, dealing with things in bite-sized but joined-up chunks. So a path there. And the other thing is for the industry and all of the commercial players to pursue a line with confidence, some confidence about the framework and the stability of the framework. I am not going to try and summarize everything else that's said. I'm going to give my colleague, erstwhile colleague and his team a job, which is I think this is worth summarizing in a short paper and putting on the web.
We will do that.
So on behalf of everyone, if there is anyone still out there, on your behalf, thank you all very much for a stimulating and thoughtful discussion. It's great.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.